I begin with the question, was Benjamin Franklin a Christian, and did he have a Christian government in mind? I'm going to start with a series of citations from Poor Richard's Almanac, which, as the read among you know, is Franklin's autobiography. Now, this is in the version I have are from pages 50 to 53. Before I enter upon my public appearance in business, it may be well to let you know the state of my mind with regard to my principles and morals, that you may see how far those influence the future events of my life. My parents had carefully given me religious impressions and brought me through my childhood piously in the descending way. But I was scarcely 15 when, after doubting by turns of several points, as I found them disputed in different books I had read, I began to doubt revelation itself. Some books against deism fell into my hands. They were said to be the substance of sermons preached at Boyle's lectures. And it happened that they wrought an effect on me quite contrary to what was intended by them, for the arguments of the deists, which were quoted to be refuted, appeared to me much stronger than the refutations. In short, I soon became a thorough deist. Here Franklin acknowledges that his Christian upbringing did not result in his conversion, and that as soon as he got on his own, he became a deist. Now, deists, remember, believe that God made the universe, set it under an inflexible code of natural laws that function automatically and always, and he went off and left it, has no more interest in it. A deist believes that Jesus Christ was not God, the Bible is not the Word of God, and the Christian Church is an organization for weaklings, fanatics, and fools. Now, some of the other deists of the early days were Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Nietzsche, Voltaire, Freud. So that should give you a fix on deism and its kindred. If they were alive today, they would all admit that they were atheists, but to do so in that day meant to shut many doors in education, government, and business, and for enterprising men that was not wise. Franklin continues, quote, "My arguments perverted some others, particularly Collins and Ralph, but each of them afterwards wronged me greatly, without the least compunction. And recollecting Keith's conduct toward me, who was another freethinker, and my own towards Vernon and Miss Reed, which at times gave me great trouble, I begin to suspect that this doctrine, though it might be true, was not very useful. My London pamphlet, which had for its motto these lines of Dryden, 'Whatever is right, though purblind man sees but a part of the chain, the nearest linked, his eye is not carrying to the equal beam that poises above all. And from the attributes of God, his infinite wisdom, goodness, and power, concluded that nothing could possibly be wrong in the world, and that vice and virtue were empty distinctions, no such things existing. Appeared now not so clever a performance as I had once thought, and I doubted whether some error had not insinuated itself unperceived into my argument, so as to infect all that followed, as is common in metaphysical reasonings." Now here Franklin says that his evangelism for this newfound and exciting view of deism was estranging him from his friends, and his beliefs had to be toned down. But he's also saying another thing that is very common in those who claim to have had their eyes open on some emotional or humanistic religious point. He's saying, it almost fell on me from the sky. I wasn't really looking for it, but it just came along. I went through a period of wondering where this wonderful revelation had come from. I was amazed and in doubt for a while, but when the power of it surged in and extinguished my doubts, well, This tacky little bit of dishonest dialogue is often employed by traitors to the true faith. What was happening to me? I didn't know what was going on. I hadn't even asked. Just things started happening. Never is true. It is never true. You find what you look for, and the gifts of the prophets are always subject to the prophets. Well, Franklin goes on, I grew convinced that truth, sincerity, and integrity in dealing between man and man were of the utmost importance to the felicity of life. And I formed written resolutions, which still remain in my journal book, to practice them ever while I lived. Revelation indeed had no weight with me as such. But I entertained an opinion that though certain actions might not be bad because they were forbidden by it, or good because it commanded them, yet probably these actions might be forbidden because they were bad for us, or commanded because they were beneficial to us in their own natures. All the circumstances of things considered. Franklin began to form his views. Revelation had no part of it. These were based not in any way upon the Bible, in which Franklin had no longer believed, if indeed he ever had, which is unlikely. Being right with men in the sight of men was the thing that Franklin was interested in. If something he believed coincided with the teaching of the Bible, it wasn't right or wrong because it was in the Bible, but because empirically it was right. Here is the beginning of Franklin's no absolutes and situation ethics, which he will perfect in a minute, and we shall note it when it comes up. Back to Franklin. And this persuasion, with the kind hand of Providence or some guardian angel or accidental favorable circumstance and situations, or altogether, preserved me through the dangers of my youth and the hazardous situations I was sometimes in among strangers, remote from the eye and advice of my father, without any willful gross immorality or injustice that might have been expected from my want of religion. I say willful because the instances I have mentioned had something of necessity in them from my youth, inexperience, and knavery of others. I had therefore a tolerable character to be in the world with. I valued it properly and determined to preserve it. His gross and grotesque immorality, which we shall note in a summary, he justifies by saying that it was not willful, but of necessity. And this necessity means, as we shall see, that it was imposed on him by God. In a book called Franklin's Writing Library, what's this book called? Franklin's Writings. Library of America is the publisher, and published in 1987. And this book, incidentally, is available in almost any library. Franklin writes on pages 70 and 71 in a thing titled Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity. And we're going to get Franklin's views on religion and government. And I'm not going to quote this whole 30-page thing to you, but I'm going to pick up here where he starts about religion. And he has number 1, in consequence of his infinite wisdom and goodness, it is asserted that whatever he doth must infinitely be wise and good. This is God he's talking about. Number 2, unless he be interrupted in his measures burdened by some other being, which is impossible because he is almighty. Here Franklin says that if anything happens in this world that God does not allow, then his almighty power has been interrupted by some other being, and we know that that is impossible because he's almighty. He continues with number 3. In consequence of his infinite power, it is asserted that nothing exists or be done in the universe which is not agreeable to his will and therefore good. End quote. Well, this logically means then that everything that happens is agreeable to God, and thus everything that happens in this world is good. Quote, number 5, evil is hereby excluded, with all merit and demerit, and likewise all preference in the esteem of God, of one part of the creation to another. This is the summary of the first part." End quote. Here Franklin summarizes the first part of his argument. In terms of use, everything is according to God's will, and since God is all-powerful and all-wise, everything is good. Well, this follows the mad ranting of Thomas Paine, another mover in the drawing of the Constitution, though he was not a signer, who said in his book, The Age of Reason, that if the Bible is correct in saying that the most glorious thing that ever took place in this world was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and if Judas were responsible for it, then Judas should be the hero and not the goat of the Christian world. Well, of course, this was cynicism on the part of Paine, who was a deist and an enemy of Christianity, and who went on to say in his book, The Age of Reason, that the Bible was the foulest document ever set to pen, and that Jesus Christ was the biggest impostor that ever lived. Well, Jefferson didn't agree with Paine on that point, though he did on most of his points. Jefferson said that Jesus Christ never claimed to be God or to be divine or to be virgin-born. These foul and corrupt teachings, he called them, were the results of low-class, inaccurate, and corrupt writers of the New Testament, not only including the Apostle Paul, but specifically targeting him for what Jefferson considered to be heretical, superstitious, mystic views. But Franklin did agree with Paine, as we shall soon see, about the Bible, that is. And he was not as loud in his condemnation of Jesus, though he quietly disclaimed any belief, either in his deity or his teachings. But we digress. Back to Franklin's writing. He goes on to say in the cite that I just gave you, that in this equal use that God makes of the universe, one part of creation has no preference with God above another. This is practically Hinduism. Now he says, quote, number 5, "Now our common notions of justice will tell us that if all created things are equally esteemed by the Creator, thought to be equally used by Him, and they are equally used by Him, we might embrace for truth upon the credit. And as the true consequence of the foregoing argument, nevertheless, we proceed to confirm it by showing how they are equally used, and that in the following manner. Number 1, a creature, when endued with life or consciousness, is capable of unease or pain. Number 2, this pain produces desire to be free from it in exact proportion to itself. Number 3, the accomplishments of this desire produces an equal pleasure. So you have pleasure equal to the amount of pain you have been given by the Creator. All right, so God gave you this restlessness and pain. Now this is my comment, and what Jefferson is saying. He also gave you the capacity to an equal amount of pleasure to balance it out. Here we see the result of Franklin's years in England studying with Hume and the empiricists and with the European philosophers, most notably Voltaire, who was his guru and his revolutionary hero, and not of himself, but also of Paine, Jefferson, Scott, Hancock, and others. Now, Christians deny this, but they do so in ignorance or dishonesty. In his writings, Jefferson acknowledges his debt to Voltaire, from whom he says he got most of his revolutionary ideas that are useful. Voltaire's sacrilegious and hedonistic philosophy, everything for the best in this best of all possible worlds, sticks out like briars in a rose garden in Jefferson, Franklin, and Paine. And in the point just cited, Franklin dabbles in Nietzsche, and you'll see yet more of this. What do I mean? Well, I'm going to wait just a moment and we'll see. Franklin goes on with his moral and governmental philosophy. Quote, number 4, and this is number 4 of subdivision number 5. They didn't use A's and B's, I guess, in those days. 4. Pleasure is consequentially equal to pain. From these propositions, it is observed, number 1, now this is the third set of number 1, this is 5.4.1, that every creature has as much pleasure as pain. Number 2, that life is not preferable to insensibility, for pleasure and pain destroy one another. That being which has 10 degrees of pain subtracted from 10 degrees of pleasure has nothing remaining, and is upon an equality with that being which is insensible to both. Now here Franklin argues that pain and pleasure cancel each other out so that we wind up even, which in his evolutionary and Eastern mind we're supposed to do by God's design. God, who sees all creatures alike and uses all creatures alike, the ant is as important in his work to God as you are in yours, is insensible to either pain or pleasure, and he's gone somewhere and he's not interested in what's going on here. It's nothing to him. And it's this way because that's the way the watchmaker made the watch before he wound it up, set its hands, and went off and left it. Well, Franklin continues his crazy quilt religious philosophy. Quote, paragraph 5.4.3. As the first part proves that all things must be equally used by the Creator because they are equally esteemed, so the second part demonstrates that they are equally esteemed because they are equally used. Equal use means equal value in the sight of the transcendental God who made the machine of the universe and committed it to inflexible and impersonal laws. Does this mean that an ant has as much value as a man in the sight of God? Franklin certainly thought it meant that. But, unlike the animal rights activists, that value to Franklin is 0. Still, that isn't really quite his main point. He means something even more sinister, as we shall see shortly. Quote, 5.4.4, paragraph. Since every action is the effect of self-unease, Franklin throws in a little bit of Freud here, and everything is motivated by a restless animal hunger for something, and then that's an insert. Since every action is the effect of self-unease, the distinction of virtue and vice is excluded, end quote. Now here it comes, my friend. The founding father advocating no absolutes, situation ethics, where nothing can be judged to be right and nothing can be judged to be wrong. In a free and autonomous society where man is a sovereign being, whatever he does is good, according to the design of God, who did not allow for anything bad to be done in this world. But even so, while it's good in the sight of God, man cannot make that judgment. There is no right, there is no wrong. Man is forced to act as an animal in need of food, sex, or power, Franklin says, and the distinction between virtue and vice is excluded. He can't say it's good or bad. He just does it, and he can only do it because unless God's almighty power is abridged, we have to do what he prescribed. Franklin continues in 5, and this is paragraph 5.4.5. No state of life can be happier than the present because pleasure and pain are inseparable. So here's Voltaire again. This is the best of all possible worlds. Thus, both parts of this argument agree with and confirm one another, and the demonstration is reciprocal. Sensible that the doctrine here advanced, if it were published, would meet with but an indifferent response. I take it something's left out there. He probably means I am sensible. That's the end of the quotation. Here Franklin indulges in unwarranted self-congratulation. I have made an argument so internally consistent and so ironclad that if I published it, the best men would be able to do would be to ignore it. I hate to be the one to tell you, Benjamin, but this is about the most illogical, tattered baloney I've ever heard. I'm far from a Plato fan myself, but how could you call his views amateurish and self-serving in light of this adolescent babbling that you have been up to? Now, Franklin has one last line of defense against criticism. This is in paragraph 546. Mankind, quote, mankind naturally and generally love to be flattered. Whatever soothes our pride and tends to exalt our species above the rest of creation, we are pleased with and easily believe, when ungrateful truths shall be with the most indignatious rejection. What? Bring ourselves down to an equality with the beasts of the field, with the meanest part of the creation? 'Tis insufferable. But, to use a piece of common sense, our geese are but geese, though we may think them swans, and truth is truth, though it sometimes prove mortifying and distasteful. Thus, Franklin, like Jefferson, will have none of Genesis, putting man in the image of God, in charge of God's creation and above the beasts. We're nothing more than the lowliest of creatures, he says, though we try to make ourselves more. This is not based on revelation in the Bible, which he readily admits means nothing to him, but what he has the temerity to call common sense. In truth, Benjamin Franklin was a low-life individual. He was crude in his habits. Soon after getting his publishing company online, he published his own book called The Art of Farting, in which he took great pride, not only because of his vulgar humor, because it caused great pain to the Christian community, and he held sex orgies at his home. In his writings, Franklin is trying to exonerate his own decadent behavior, which he says was not decadent because he had no malicious intent. But in these writings, he, who had a great interest and input in the Constitution, is justifying the revolution, rejected by his parents, whom he calls dissenters, and the rest of the fundamental community as being unbiblical, murderous, and cruel. There is no such thing, Franklin argues. There is no virtue. There is no vice. We can never make such judgments. The pain that we have dealt to others, according to Nietzsche, who has a better philosophy than Jesus, is part of the good creation of God. And if we find up at zero for pain we receive by others because of it, we're nothing more nor less than the person who refuses to feel either. We mortal creatures born to die will wind up at zero, whether we're revolutionaries or dissenters. God, who is transcendental, can never be known by his creatures. He can never feel pain or pleasure himself, and he does not feel ours. He does not care one way or the other. From their own pens, we know the religion of Franklin and Jefferson. Do you still believe that D. James Kennedy can prove Jefferson was a Christian in the Orthodox sense? My friends, this goes beyond foolishness and dishonesty. It is motivated by something very dark. Before we're through, I'm going to tell you what that motivation is. Now, next time, if the Lord wills it to be so, we will put these governmental philosophies in place, compare them to the Bible, see whether or not they had any Christian elements or virtues, and perhaps, if time permits, we'll get into the subject of whether a Christian nation is possible at all in this world.